There are moments in life that divide your existence into before and after. For Kirk Douglas, that moment came on a Paris film set in 1953, and it had nothing to do with cameras or scripts. He was engaged to another woman. His career was at its peak. He had everything Hollywood could offer. But when Anne Buydens, a war survivor who had spent years in Nazi-occupied Europe, looked at him with those unflinching eyes and said, "Mr. Douglas, I don't date actors," something cracked inside the armor Kirk had built over decades. He had 48 hours to finish filming and return to Los Angeles to his fiancée. 48 hours to make a choice that would either save him or destroy everything he'd carefully constructed. And for the first time in his life, Kirk Douglas had no idea which path he was going to take. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more untold Hollywood tales, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you the real stories behind the legends. Kirk Douglas arrived in Paris in early 1953 with the confidence of a man who owned the world. At 36, he was one of Hollywood's biggest stars, fresh off the success of The Bad and the Beautiful, a film that would earn him an Academy Award nomination. He was engaged to Pier Angeli, a stunning Italian actress who graced magazine covers across America. His smile was famous, his jaw was legendary, and his reputation with women was well established. Kirk Douglas didn't chase women. Women chased him. That was the natural order of his universe, and he had no reason to believe Paris would be any different. The film was called Act of Love, a romantic drama that would require 6 weeks of location shooting in the City of Light. The studio had hired a local publicist to handle the French press, someone who spoke the language and understood European media. Her name was Anne Buydens, and she came highly recommended. Kirk barely noticed her during their first meeting. She was professional, efficient, and seemed entirely uninterested in the fact that she was standing in front of a movie star. This, in itself, should have been his first warning. And Buydens was 33 years old, blonde, elegant, and carried herself with a quiet strength that came from surviving experiences Kirk couldn't begin to imagine. She had lived through the Nazi occupation of Belgium, had worked in the underground resistance, and had rebuilt her life from absolute zero after the war. She had learned 3 languages fluently, had worked her way up in the competitive world of European publicity, and had developed an internal compass that could detect insincerity from a mile away. When she looked at Kirk Douglas, she didn't see a movie star. She saw a man trying very hard to be impressive, and she found it exhausting. Kirk made his move during the second week of filming. He invited Anne to dinner at one of Paris's finest restaurants, expecting the usual result, and declined politely, explaining she preferred to keep professional relationships professional. Kirk, who had never encountered this particular form of resistance, assumed she was playing hard to get. He tried again the next day, this time suggesting a casual lunch. And countered by recommending a bistro where they could discuss publicity strategy and split the bill. Kirk agreed, thinking this was progress. It wasn't. During that lunch, something unexpected happened, and asked him real questions, not about his movies or his fame, but about his childhood, his family, his thoughts on things that had nothing to do with Hollywood. Kirk found himself talking about Isser Danielovich, the poor kid from Amsterdam, New York, whose mother barely spoke English and whose father was a ragman. He talked about feeling like an outsider, about the shame of poverty, about the hunger that drove him, and listened without judgment, without the usual Hollywood responses. And when she spoke, she told him about her own war, her own losses, her own rebuilding. For the first time in years, Kirk Douglas had a conversation with a woman that didn't revolve around Kirk Douglas, the movie star. But what really shook him came at the end of that lunch, and thanked him for the interesting conversation, paid for her half of the meal despite his protests, and told him she had to get back to work. No phone number, no suggestion of meeting again, no indication that she saw him as anything other than a client. Kirk sat alone at that table for 20 minutes after she left, genuinely confused about what had just happened. Over the next 10 days, Kirk's pursuit intensified, but not in his usual way. He found himself wanting to impress, and not with his fame or his money, but with his thoughts, his ideas, his real self. He would seek her out between scenes, not to flirt, but to continue conversations they'd started days before. He asked her about books, about art, about her views on life. And slowly, and began to see past the movie star facade. She saw the intelligence Kirk usually hid behind his tough guy image. She saw the insecurity he masked with arrogance. She saw the little boy who still felt like he had to prove he deserved to be in the room, and had her own rules, forged in the fires of war and survival. She had seen too much, lost too much, to play games with her heart. She told Kirk plainly that she didn't date actors because actors lived in a world of illusion, and she had fought too hard for reality. She told him she wasn't interested in being another name in his romantic history. Most devastatingly, she told him that until he figured out who Kirk Douglas actually was beneath all the Hollywood armor, he wasn't ready for anything real with anyone. These words hit Kirk like a physical blow. Because deep down, in the place he rarely let himself look, he knew she was right. His engagement to Fiancée was more about image than love, a pretty picture for the magazines. His entire life in Hollywood was a performance, carefully managed, always on. Even his relationships were transactions, negotiations, power plays, and was offering him something he'd never had before, the chance to be real. And it terrified him. With 2 days left before filming wrapped, Kirk received a telegram from his agent in Los Angeles. Fiancée's publicist wanted to schedule their engagement photos for the week Kirk returned. The wedding was being planned for early summer. America's magazines were already writing about the perfect Hollywood romance. Everything was arranged, locked in, exactly as it should be for a man of Kirk Douglas's stature. Kirk crumpled the telegram and walked alone through Paris streets at midnight, past the Seine, past couples walking hand in hand, past cafes where he could hear laughter and life continuing around him. For the first time in his adult life, Kirk Douglas felt genuinely lost. He had spent decades building his career, his image, his power. He had become exactly what he dreamed of as that poor kid in Amsterdam, New York. And had shown him something in these Paris weeks that he couldn't unsee. The difference between having everything and having something that mattered. The next morning on set, Kirk's performance was off. The director called him out during a crucial scene, asking what was wrong. Kirk couldn't answer. How could he explain that he was having an existential crisis in the middle of a love scene because he'd finally met someone who made him question everything he thought he knew about love? The revelation came not in a dramatic scene, but in a quiet moment. It was the final day of filming, late afternoon, and the crew was setting up for the last shot. Kirk found Anne in the production office, going through press clippings. He sat down across from her and said something he'd never said to a woman before. "I don't know what to do." No charm, no performance, just raw honesty. And looked up from her work, and for the first time, Kirk saw her expression soften. She put down the papers and told him story. During the war, and had been in love with a young man in the Belgian resistance. They had planned to marry after the liberation, but he was killed in the final months of the war, shot by retreating German soldiers, and described standing at his grave after the liberation, surrounded by celebration and victory, feeling completely empty. She had decided then that she would never again give her heart to someone who wasn't fully present, fully real, fully capable of meeting her in the depth of what she'd survived. She had dated after the war, had offers from wealthy men, successful men, but none of them had ever really seen her. Until, she admitted quietly, Kirk Douglas started asking real questions. Kirk felt something break open inside him. Not the crack in the armor, but the armor itself falling away completely. He told, and everything, about his engagement to Fiancée being more about image than love, about his pattern of relationships that were really just conquests, about the loneliness of being Kirk Douglas, always performing, never quite real, about how these weeks in Paris had shown him what he'd been missing his entire adult life, a genuine connection with someone who saw him, really saw him, and didn't need him to be anything other than who he actually was. And listened to all of this without interruption. When Kirk finished, she said something that would change both their lives forever. She told him she'd been falling in love with him too, despite her better judgment, despite her rules, despite everything she'd promised herself. But she gave him an ultimatum that most women in 1953 Hollywood would never dare give Kirk Douglas. Go back to Los Angeles. Face your fiancé honestly. Deal with your real life. And if after all that you still want what we might have together, come find me. But don't come find me as Kirk Douglas the movie star. Come find me as the man I've been talking to in Paris. Kirk flew back to Los Angeles the next morning. The story of what happened in those next weeks would become Hollywood legend. Kirk broke off his engagement to Pierre Angeli, despite the media storm it created. He ignored his publicist's advice, his agent's warnings, and the studio's concerns about his image. He told Pierre the truth, that he'd met someone in Paris who'd made him realize he couldn't marry anyone while his heart was somewhere else. Pierre, hurt but ultimately understanding, called off the engagement publicly, citing busy schedules and different life paths. 6 weeks later, Kirk Douglas returned to Europe, not for a film, not for publicity, but to find Anne Buydens. He tracked her down to her apartment in Paris, knocked on her door at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, and when she opened it, he said simply, "I'm here. Not Kirk Douglas the actor. Just me. And I have no idea if this will work, but I know I have to try." What Anne saw standing in her doorway was different from the man who'd left Paris 8 weeks earlier. The performance was gone. The need to impress was gone. What remained was a 36-year-old man who'd finally stopped running from himself long enough to figure out what he actually wanted, and invited him in, and they talked through the night. Not about movies or Hollywood or publicity. They talked about what a real life together might look like, about her need for honesty and his pattern of deception, about his intensity and her need for independence, about whether two people from such different worlds could actually build something lasting. Kirk Douglas and Anne Buydens married in May 1954 in a small ceremony that shocked Hollywood, and wasn't an actress. She wasn't interested in the spotlight. She kept her career in publicity. She demanded equal partnership in a time when Hollywood wives were expected to be decorative accessories. And Kirk, for the first time in his life, met someone as his equal, and traveled with him to film locations, but maintained her own professional identity. She advised him on career decisions, but made her own career moves. She challenged him constantly, never letting him retreat into the safe performance of being Kirk Douglas the movie star. Their marriage would last 66 years, until Kirk's death in 2020 at age 103. In Hollywood, where marriages are measured in months, this was almost miraculous. But those who knew them understood why it worked, and had given Kirk something no one else ever had: permission to be real. And Kirk had given Anne something she thought she'd lost in the war: the ability to trust her heart again. Kirk would later say in interviews that meeting Anne in Paris saved his life, not in a dramatic movie plot way, but in the deepest sense. Before Anne, he was playing a role 24 hours a day, never quite sure where Kirk Douglas ended and Isser Danielovich began. After Anne, he knew exactly who he was: a man who'd been given an extraordinary second chance and was determined not to waste it. The telegram from that Paris night in 1953, the one announcing engagement photos with Pierre Angeli, stayed in Kirk's desk drawer for the rest of his life. He would occasionally take it out and look at it, remembering the man he'd been when he received it: successful, famous, engaged, and completely lost. And then he'd look at Anne reading in their living room or working on her own projects, and he'd remember the choice he made in those 48 hours that changed everything. Because some moments really do divide your life into before and after. For Kirk Douglas, that moment came when a Belgian war survivor looked at him with unflinching eyes and refused to let him hide behind his fame. What came after that moment was 66 years of the most real relationship either of them ever had. In a city built on illusion, Kirk Douglas and Anne Buydens found something more valuable than any movie success. They found the truth. And once you've found that, everything else is just performance.